Okay, time to review AMD's new Radeon RX 9070 XT. And you know what? My legs are a bit sore today. Probably all that ladder climbing I did yesterday. So I think I'm going to go sit down for this one. That's better, isn't it? A bit more comfortable. Now, a lot has been said about the 9070 XT. So much so that it kind of feels like we've already reviewed it. But to date, we've relied on nothing more than leaks and first-party benchmarks, and neither of which are typically that reliable. So today, finally, we are taking a very in-depth look at the 9070 XT to see what it's all about. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duranaut high-performance thermal paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. But before we jump into the benchmark data, I'll quickly go over what the 9070 series is. There are two models. The standard 9070, which is a binned or cut down version of the 9070 XT. Both are based on the same 357 square millimeter die. The 9070 XT packs 4,096 cores, whereas the 9070's core count has been reduced by 13% to 3,584 cores. It's also said to operate the cores at 2070 MHz, so a 14% reduction when compared to the XT version, though the actual core clock speeds will differ under load. As for the memory subsystem, it's identical for both models. So 16GB of 20 gigabits per second GDDR6 memory on a 256-bit wide memory bus, resulting in a bandwidth of 640 gigabytes per second. Now all this means is the 9070 series should be very economical to produce, given the die size is similar to that of the 7800 XT, and the memory subsystem is also the same. AMD managed to sell that part for $500 US or less, so they should be making a decent amount of money on even the cut down 9070 silicon, which has been given an MSRP of $550 US, while the full-blown 9070 XT is set to cost $600 US. The matchup on paper between the older 7900 XT and the 9070 XT is quite interesting. The 9070 XT packs 24% fewer cores, the die size has been reduced by 33%, the cache capacity has also been reduced, this time by 20%, there's 20% less VRAM, and the memory bandwidth has also been slashed by 20%, yet it is meant to deliver similar or better performance, so that's going to be very interesting to see. Now, on hand for testing, I have a number of 9070 XT graphics cards. I will be reviewing the 9070 in tomorrow's video, so the focus for today will be on the 9070 XT. And all of our benchmark results are based on the Sapphire Pure model. But along with the Pure, I also have the Nitro Plus, XFX Mercury, ASUS TUF Gaming, and ASRock Taichi. When placed under load, we saw hotspot GPU temperatures range from as low as 75 degrees with the XFX Mercury to as high as 87 degrees, which quite shockingly was seen with the Nitro Plus. That's particularly odd given the Pure maxed out at 81 degrees. The ASUS TUF Gaming ran cool at 80 degrees, while the ASRock Taichi hit 85 degrees. Still, given that this is a hotspot temperature, all models did run very cool. The GDDR6 memory operated at 85 degrees on the ASUS and XFX models, while the rest ran at 90 degrees. Then for the GPU VRM temperatures, we have quite a large range. The ASRock Taichi and Sapphire Nitro Plus both peaked at over 80 degrees, while the Pure reached 79 degrees. Then we have the XFX Mercury and ASUS TUF Gaming, both of which kept their VRM comfortably below 70 degrees. Now, when it came to operating volume, the ASRock Taichi along with the Sapphire Pure and Nitro Plus were all virtually silent, generating less noise than our case fans. The XFX Mercury was also very quiet and could only just be heard over the case fans, while the ASUS TUF Gaming was noticeably audible, but still reasonably quiet. As for core clock speeds, all models were much the same, with no more than a 3% variance out of the box, so there shouldn't be too much performance difference between these various models. So that's all the AIB cards we have on hand for the moment. For now, I think we should move on and get into the blue bar graphs. First up, we have Marvel Rivals at 1440p, and here the 9070 XT was good for 88 FPS on average, though that did make it 7% slower than the 5070 Ti and just 6% faster than the 7900 XT. So not bad, but also not an amazing start. Then at 4K, it slips a little further behind the 5070 Ti, now trailing by an 11% margin with 51 FPS on average. Moving on to Stalker 2. Again at 1440p, the 9070 XT is coming in slower than the 5070 Ti, this time trailing by a 9% margin, which actually made it 2% slower than the 7900 XT, so that's a disappointing result. Bumping the resolution up to 4K did help, and now it's just 5% slower than the 5070 Ti and 5% faster than the 7900 XT. Still not an amazing result, but probably good enough despite only rendering 39 FPS on average. This time we see when testing with Counter-Strike 2 that the 9070 XT is coming in 10% slower than the 5070 Ti, which is quite a significant margin. In fact, here it only managed to match the 7900 GRE. This is a very weak result, and sadly this isn't a game AMD benchmarked for their review guide, so I'm not sure if they're also seeing the same poor performance, or they would if they tested it. It's also quite surprising that they're not actually testing the most popular game on Steam. And things only got worse at 4K. Here the new Radeon GPU trailed the 5070 Ti by a 16% margin, only roughly matching the RTX 5070. Finally, we have a game in God of War Ragnarok where the 9070 XT is able to match the 5070 Ti, and I wouldn't say it necessarily won at 1440p given it was a mere 1% faster, but seeing RTX 4080 like performance was impressive. The 4K margins are really much the same. Here the 9070 XT was just 1% slower than the 5070 Ti, so again it was able to deliver 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 like performance, so that's very good. The Delta Force performance wasn't great. Here the 9070 XT averaged 160 FPS, which is certainly great performance, but that result meant it was 8% slower than the 5070 Ti and 10% slower than the 7900 XT. So I'm not sure what went wrong there to see it deliver 4070 Super-like performance. The 4K results were a lot better though. Here it matched the 7900 XT, so still not an amazing result in on itself, and that did make it 6% slower than the 5070 Ti. So overall, not a particularly great game for the new Radeon GPU. Now, the 9070 XT was excellent in Space Marine 2, beating even the 7900 XTX. Also, please note that the Blackwell results aren't wrong. For whatever reason, the new GeForce 50 series performs very poorly in this game, and so far Nvidia hasn't been able to address this, so as a result, the 9070 XT is 17% faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, and then at 4K it ends up being a massive 36% faster. And again, I really don't know what's wrong here with the GeForce 50 series. I actually ended up throwing all my results out and retesting this entire game for all GPUs due to a recent update where I thought it changed performance, but really the performance for most of the GPUs is much the same. It's just the Blackwell GPUs that appear broken, and Nvidia really does need to address this. Star Wars Jedi Survivor has another example for us where the 9070 XT is actually slower than the 7900 XT at 1440p, albeit by just 2 FPS, but perhaps more importantly, that meant it was 12% slower than the 5070 Ti. And that margin does shrink slightly to 8% at 4K, but even so, just 53 FPS on average means that the 9070 XT was only slightly faster than the 4070 Ti Super and 7900 XT. The 9070 XT performs well in a Plague Tale Requiem, coming in just behind the 7900 XTX at 1440p, though that did make it 7% slower than the 5070 Ti, but I think overall that is a solid result. Now at 4K, the 9070 XT is 4% slower than the 5070 Ti with 65 FPS on average, so the same level of performance seen from the RTX 4080, and I think that's quite impressive. Now the Radeon GPUs have always performed well in Cyberpunk 2077, and the 9070 XT thankfully is no exception, rendering 125 FPS at 1440p, allowing it to match the 5070 Ti, and that also made it 11% faster than the 7900 XT. Then at 4K, it pulled slightly ahead of the 5070 Ti, albeit by a mere 3% margin, but that meant that it was now 17% faster than the 7900 XT, so a great result overall. Unfortunately though, the 9070 XT struggled quite a bit in Dying Light 2, only just beating the older 7900 XT, which saw it come in 12% slower than the 5070 Ti. And the 4K data is much the same. Here the 9070 XT was again 12% slower than the 5070 Ti, though it was also 12% faster than the 7900 XT. Call of Duty's always been a positive title for AMD, and Black Ops 6 is no exception. Here the 9070 XT spat out an impressive 118 FPS at 1440p, allowing it to roughly match the 7900 XTX, and this saw it beat the 5070 Ti by an impressive 22% margin. Then at 4K, it led the 5070 Ti by a 19% margin, again delivering 7900 XTX-like performance. So another excellent result here for the new 9070 XT. Next up we have Dragon Age The Veilguard, and this game does use some ray tracing with the Ultra preset, but even so, the 9070 XT still performed okay, coming in 4% slower than the 5070 Ti, though really we're only looking at roughly 7900 XT performance in this example. Now at 4K, the 9070 XT matched the 4070 Ti Super, making it 10% faster than the 7900 XT, but also 10% slower than the 5070 Ti. Unfortunately, Radeon GPUs perform quite poorly relative to the GeForce competition in War Thunder when using the default DirectX 11 mode. The 9070 XT was only able to match the 7900 XT, making it a massive 31% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p. However, when we increase the resolution to 4K, things change quite dramatically, and now the 9070 XT is very impressive, matching the 7900 XTX and 5070 Ti with 227 FPS. The Spider-Man Remastered performance is pretty disappointing. At 1440p, the 9070 XT ended up slower than the 7900 XT, and that saw it trail the 5070 Ti by an 8% margin. But as we often see, the 4K data is more positive, and here it matched the 5070 Ti with 118 FPS. The Hogwarts Legacy performance looks promising, though that is until you realise that despite being 4% faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, the 9070 XT is still slower than both the 9700 XT and XTX. That does all change though at 4K, and here the 9070 XT managed to outperform not just the 5070 Ti, but also the 7900 XTX with an impressive 87 FPS on average. The 9070 XT was 5% slower than the 5070 Ti in The Last of Us Part 1, rendering 106 FPS on average, which actually made it a few frames slower than the 7900 XT. Then at 4K, it was 3% slower than the 5070 Ti, though it was at least 9% faster than the 7900 XT. Performance in Star Wars Outlaws was decent. Here the 9070 XT was just 5% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, but 13% faster than the 7900 XT. Then at 4K, it basically matched the 5070 Ti and 7900 XTX, which meant it was now 21% faster than the 7900 XT. Finally, we have Starfield, and here the 9070 XT was 7% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, as it only delivered 7900 XT-like performance. The 4K data was more favourable, but even so, it was only able to roughly match the 5070 Ti, while just edging out the likes of Nvidia's RTX 4070 Ti Super. Okay, so across the 18 games that I used for testing, the 9070 XT averaged 119 FPS at 1440p, which made it 6% slower than the 5070 Ti, and I believe AMD were expecting to see parity there. It's not far off, mind you, but the Radeon GPU was slower overall. Perhaps more troubling though is the fact that AMD claimed the 9070 XT was on average 37% faster than the 7900 GRE for raster performance, but we found just a 20% improvement when looking at mostly raster performance. And just as troubling is the fact that the 9070 XT is just 2% faster than the 7900 XT and 13% slower than the 7900 XTX. Now at 4K, the 9070 XT does look a bit better, coming in just 1% slower than the 5070 Ti and 9% faster than the 7900 XT. Not exactly amazing performance overall, but at $600 it could end up being something pretty special, and we'll look at that in a moment. Now when it comes to power consumption, the 9070 XT, it isn't exactly amazing, but it's also not bad. When compared to RDNA 3, little has changed. As we just saw, you're roughly getting 7900 XT performance for roughly 7900 XT power consumption. So we're often looking at around 20% more power usage than the 5070 Ti for slightly weaker performance. So when it comes to ray tracing performance, the 9070 XT is generally much better than RDNA 3. And we see this when comparing with parts such as the 7900 XT and even the XTX. In Metro Exodus at 1440p, the 9070 XT was 9% slower than the 5070 Ti, but it was also 34% faster than the 7900 XT and 12% faster than the XTX. Then at 4K, it trailed the 5070 Ti by a 12% margin and was 18% faster than the 7900 XTX and a whopping 44% faster than the 7900 XT. The Alan Wake 2 performance though, it's not good, but also it's the first ever Radeon GPU that will allow for over 30 FPS at 1440p with upscaling when using the high ray tracing settings, so I guess that's something. It's also a massive 44% performance uplift when compared to the 7900 XTX, but despite that it is still 36% slower than the 5070 Ti. Then at 4K, the demands are obviously too extreme, and even here the 5070 Ti is only able to average 31 FPS. Now the Cyberpunk 2077 Ultra Ray Tracing performance is quite impressive from the 9070 XT. At 1440p using upscaling, it managed to render 68 FPS, making it just 8% slower than the 5070 Ti, which is an incredible result for a Radeon GPU, and that meant it was 24% faster than the 7900 XTX and 51% faster than the 7900 XT. As expected though, it did struggle at 4K when using upscaling, but even so, the 9070 XT was 12% slower than the 5070 Ti, and then 29% faster than the 7900 XTX. Despite running into a CPU bottleneck in Spider-Man Remastered, the 9070 XT was still 22% faster than the 7900 XTX at 1440p. Then jumping up to 4K sees the 9070 XT trailing the 5070 Ti by just 7%, though this also meant the new Radeon GPU was a few frames slower than the XTX. Next up we have Dying Light 2, and here the 9070 XT was 14% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, making it slightly faster than the 7900 XTX, which is another great result. Then at 4K it again just managed to edge out the XTX, coming in 29% slower than the 5070 Ti. Black Myth Wukong still isn't too kind to the Radeon GPU. The 9070 XT rendered just 30 FPS at 1440p, which is an almost 60% boost from the XTX, but also roughly half the performance of the 5070 Ti. That being the case, we don't really need to talk about the 4K results, but here they are anyway. Finally, we have Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and this was a great cluster for the 9070 XT, just 17 FPS on average at 1440p with upscaling. Of course, I also ran the numbers at 4K, but again, as you can see, you can just ignore this data as none of these GPUs are able to deliver playable performance, or at least what we would call playable performance under these conditions. Okay, so here's a look at the average ray tracing performance seen at 1440p when generally using upscaling, and here the 9070 XT was 21% slower than the 5070 Ti, but an impressive 26% faster than the 7900 XTX. So with RDNA 4, AMD has made huge strides when it comes to RT performance. Now, a lot of the 4K data was a bust for the 9070 XT, though for quite a few titles the 5070 Ti was also extremely slow. Even so, we have the data, and here the 9070 XT was on average 25% slower than the 5070 Ti. Now it's time for the all-important cost per frame analysis, and we'll start with the elusive MSRP, so the fake MSRP data if you will, at least when it comes to Nvidia's Blackwell GPUs. If the 5070 Ti was readily available at $750 US, which it currently isn't, the 9070 XT is only offering 15% better value, which is reasonable, but in the past we've felt AMD needs to offer 20% better value for a solid review recommendation. Of course, with RDNA 4, we're now getting better ray tracing performance and FSR 4, which we're in the process of analysing, and we'll have a dedicated and highly detailed video for you shortly. So perhaps we're at a point where 15% better value can result in a review recommendation. In fact, I'm pretty confident it can now, but I'll talk more about this in a moment. For now, let's look at what is considered to be the real MSRP. As it stands, if AMD can deliver the 9070 XT for $600 US, and we've been reliably informed by multiple sources that they can and will, then as things stand right now, the 9070 XT will be delivering 29% better value than the 5070 Ti. And this is key because we believe, based on sales data evidence, that AMD needs to deliver 30% greater value than their nearest GeForce competitor in order to convert GeForce owners to becoming Radeon owners. Now, if we compare the 9070 XT to the best retail prices from mid-2024, it still looks very good, delivering nearly 20% better value than the discounted 7900 XT, AMD's best value offering in this performance range. It's also 26% better value than the 4070 Ti Super. So there you have it, the new Radeon RX 9070 XT, and I've got to admit, this is a difficult one to sum up. On one hand, I know there's going to be some people who are quite disappointed with the performance they've seen here, even when keeping the price in mind, and maybe that's on AMD and their performance claims, which I'll get to soon. But I think overall, what's on offer here in the current market is very good and worthy of recommendation. There's really two main conclusions that you can make here. One being, if the 5070 Ti stays well above MSRP, so typically around $900 US, along with the poor availability, then at $600 US, the 9070 XT is going to be a no-brainer. It's offering almost 30% better value. You would be mad not to buy it. But the other conclusion being, if the 5070 Ti manages to drop down to the MSRP, then the 9070 XT becomes 20% cheaper to purchase, and in terms of cost per frame, it's just 15% better value. It's a little over 20% slower on average for ray tracing, and then you have to weigh up the other features, which we're in the process of doing some of that. I certainly think saving $150 US by going with the 9070 XT is going to be a good idea for most gamers, but whether or not AMD can convince most gamers of this, well, that's an entirely different story. And historic data would suggest that this isn't enough to convert GeForce owners. It's also worth noting that although I've closely compared the 9070 XT's performance with the 5070 Ti, in terms of pricing, it's actually much closer to the standard RTX 5070. The thing is though, the RTX 5070 sucks. It's a poor value option with just 12GB of VRAM, so based on that fact alone, I don't recommend it. And therefore, comparing the 9070 XT to a GPU we already don't recommend seems like a waste of time, and not really a great win for the new 9070 XT. Also, just another side note, for the Radeon 7000 versus GeForce 40 series, Tim and myself agreed that AMD needed to offer at least 20% better cost per frame value in order for us to recommend Radeon GPUs. But with the Radeon 9000 versus GeForce 50 series, we feel this does need to be revised downwards, probably to 15%, and this is due to the improved ray tracing performance and the fact that AMD's upscaling technology has improved dramatically and should close the gap to DLSS, though we are still busy investigating if that is indeed the case. So it's a little too early to call right now, but what we can say is FSR 4 is worlds better than FSR 3. So all of this certainly does help the 9070 XT, at least in our eyes, but what gamers at large think could be a different story. And therefore AMD might still need to be targeting a 30% discount again to convert those GeForce owners. But what all this means is, in a world where the 9070 XT can be purchased for $600 and the 5070 Ti $750, it's difficult to recommend one over the other. There's pros and cons to either choice, which is why we felt for AMD to really crush Nvidia's mid-range this generation, the 9070 XT would have to hit $550 US. But if supply of the 5070 Ti remains weak, and therefore prices sky high, the 9070 XT should win anyway. So in short, we feel if AMD can maintain a 20% margin to the 5070 Ti, as in 20% better cost per frame, then the 9070 XT will be the obvious choice in our opinion. No need to toss up between the two, just get the Radeon GPU for that nice discount. Now to change gears for a moment, I'm a bit concerned that AMD has managed to once again set the wrong expectations, this time of course for the 9070 XT, by comparing it to the GRE and then quoting what looks to be heavily inflated numbers, at least when compared to our own independent testing. AMD claimed that the 9070 XT was on average 35% faster than the GRE for raster performance at 1440p, but in reality we found it to be just 20% faster. Different sample of games of course, but some examples: AMD claimed a 39% improvement in Dragon Age, but I only got 25%, then 32% in Starfield, but I only saw 20%, and 29% better performance in Stalker, whereas I only saw 16% better performance. So perhaps in the games without built-in benchmarks, AMD is testing in an area with a lighter load. I'm not really sure how the numbers differ so much, but in reality, AMD's numbers make the GRE appear much slower than it really is, or of course the 9070 XT are much faster than it really is. The fact is, a 35% boost over the GRE would make the 9070 XT as fast as the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super based on our data, and I did see many people claiming that would indeed be the case based on AMD's first-party benchmark results. We believe AMD was set to charge at least $650 US for the 9070 XT, and they were under the impression that that would be a great price. And this would make sense if it really was 35% faster than the GRE and able to match or even beat the 5070 Ti. So like what we saw with the release of the Ryzen 7 9700X, I'm not really sure how AMD is doing their internal testing. Okay, so I'm going to stand for this bit because I'm not really sure how real the $600 US MSRP is. And this is because I've done some digging around and it sounds like while there will be some stock available at the MSRP, in order to achieve this, AMD is providing retailers a $50 US rebate. This is sort of a temporary thing, or it could be, and this suggests that the price was intended to be at least $650 US. That's ultimately what AMD want for this product. But at least for now, AMD are subsidizing some models so they can hit that $600 US MSRP, but it's going to be, I imagine, in limited numbers. XFX, for example, have told me that the 9070 Mercury, the model we featured in this video, this guy right here, this one won't be selling at the $650 US MSRP. Won't even cost $700. Rather, the actual MSRP from XFX for this one is a whopping $770 US. And on-shelf pricing for the US, because of tariffs and all that fun stuff, it's expected to be $850 US. So that's a bit tragic if true. Now, based on the information I have been able to gather, it does sound as though AMD is starting to play the game. That is, of course, Nvidia's game. So this means the $600 US MSRP might not really be a thing beyond sort of the initial, very limited supply of MSRP models. And that leaves everything else well above $600. And restocks of those MSRP models, let's say, are expected to be few and far between. So I think how this is going to ultimately play out will depend on how sales go. AMD does have a lot of 9070 series stock, so if sales are slow after the initial demand, then I'm sure they will keep those rebates going. But of course, we'll just have to wait and see how that one plays out. Anyway, as things stand, no pun intended, the Radeon RX 9070 XT is a great offering that we expect will sell extremely well at $600. But hitting that price is certainly in question at this point in time. So again, we have to see how that one plays out before, I suppose, ultimately making our decision on how successful this product has been. But yeah, at the $600, if they can do that, it's good. And if they do manage to sell out, so if the pricing's good and AMD sell all of the stock that they have, what that means is they will have sold considerably more 9070 XTs than NVIDIA has 5090s, 5080s, 5070s, and 5070 Ti's combined. So that's pretty crazy. And on that bombshell, I'm going to end this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. We have the 9070 reviews on the non-XT model coming tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have a bit more pricing information and have a bit more insight into how things are playing out by the time that video goes live. We also have the join button, Patreon. If you want to become a member, you get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.